Hello everybody, Ollie here. One of the questions I get a lot running the show is how do I read so many books so quickly, and do I have any tips for getting through them? Now, I'm lucky enough to not have any reading difficulties like dyslexia, and I'm also a trained actor, so being able to master text quickly is part of my job. But I do have some top tips for getting ideas off a page and into my brain efficiently, and hopefully they'll help you as well. Tip 1. Read 2 books at once. This one sounds weird. I don't mean that I read 2 books simultaneously. What I mean is I'll have 2 books on the go and I'll read a chapter of one and then a chapter of another one, and I find it just keeps the ideas fresh in my mind and keeps me paying attention. It works especially well if the books are about contrasting things. So for instance, at the moment I'm rereading one of my favourite novels, Mary Shelley's The Last Man, which is just on my nightstand, just there out of the shot, and I'm also reading Sarah Ahmed's The Cultural Politics of Emotion, and because they have very different speeds and one's fiction and one's not, it just helps me pay attention a bit more. Often with academic books, they'll try and say a lot in a chapter and it'll be quite meaty, and if I try and sit and read 2 chapters of an academic book in one reading, the points that it's making will just kind of tend to bleed into one and I won't really remember it very well. But if I physically stop myself and then pick up a chapter of something else and read it if I'm still in a reading mood, then I find I retain it a lot more easily. Tip 2. Read on the go. I used to take my headphones with me just about anywhere I went, but now if I'm going to be getting on the tube, and it's about a 40-minute tube ride from where I live into central London, then I'll just take a plastic bag with a couple of books in me and I'll read it on the go instead. Or if ever I'm going home to Newcastle, then I'll take a book with me on the train and I'll read that instead of listening to music. And if you have a commute to anywhere, not necessarily within London, and obviously not if you're like having to drive a car, and you're not one of the people who gets motion sickness reading inside vehicles, which I know some people do, then consider, if you already listen to a lot of music, swapping out some of that music for time spent reading. Tip 3. Highlighters. I feel like this one might make librarians or bibliophiles angry. I always feel a little bit guilty when I mark a book. But I do now when I go through. I started a few months ago. I do just highlight important passages, or even when I'm reading fiction, I highlight things that are especially beautiful or moving to me. Or often in an academic book, they'll say the same thing like maybe 2 or 3 different ways, and I might not necessarily pick up on all of them, but then I'll highlight the one that made me go, okay, now it's this analogy that helped me understand it, or it's this sentence that really got me through it. And it means that I can revisit it very, very quickly and find the bits that I need to if I'm, for instance, writing a script about it for the show. Tip 4. Make notes. So I have 2 ways of making notes. If I'm just reading a book casually and I don't need to kind of write an essay on it or anything, then I just keep a little pencil with me and I'll write my comments in the margin or my questions, or I'll highlight bits. A lot of the time I'll put like CF, which means cross-reference, and be like, oh, this reminds me of something that another author has said, or this point is quite similar to something else someone else wrote, because often when I'm writing an episode I'll try and not just have one idea, I'll try and have 2 or 3 different ideas that link together, and I find that helps if I'm like, oh, this reminds me of something that Falcon Chet said, or that Helen Sugar said, and then now I've got those 2 ideas and I can put them together. So I just keep a little pencil and I write notes in the margin. I once did a Twitter thread of everything I wrote in the margins of Slavoj Žižek's book Violence, completely out of context. I just put them all on a Twitter thread, and that was really funny. It does mean that I feel a bit nervous when I'm finished with a book and I'm not going to keep it if I want to give it away to a charity shop. I'm like, oh, did I write anything embarrassing in the margins of this, or anything rude or disparaging about the author? Like, if I need to understand the material at a lot more depth, like for instance when I was writing essays at university or whatever, as I read it I would sit there with a pad of paper and a pen, or with a Word document open, and I would make summarising notes as I went through it. I found that was especially useful when I was studying Kant for the first time, and it just helps me not only understand the material better, but it also prompts me to read slower and means that I tend to skip over things less. Tip 5. Don't be afraid of going back. I used to have a real issue about not reading the same thing twice. Not necessarily just reading the same book twice, but even sort of sentences and paragraphs. I felt a real need, kind of competing with myself to go, oh, I need to get it first time, and once I've read it, I'll never reread it. Like, I have now read Shakespeare, or I have now read Sartre, or whatever it is, and the more I read, the more I realise that's just not helpful. Like, I do as I read. I think probably most people do. I sometimes get a bit lazy if I'm tired or if I drink or whatever, then I'll sort of skip over sentences and now I'll just make myself go back. So if you similarly are quite competitive with yourself about that, that kind of holds me back with my reading, and we don't really need it. When I finished reading Falcon Chet's book Toward a Political Philosophy of Race, I kind of took a minute to absorb the message, and then I immediately turned right back to the start and read the whole thing over again, because I thought, oh wow, you know, this book is amazing and it's really changed the way I think, and I want to make sure I understand it and really got it. And those are my top 5 tips for taking on troublesome text. I hope you find them very, very useful. If you're looking for book recommendations, then you should subscribe, because a lot of my videos have bibliographies and recommended readings underneath them. And thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed these tips, I have a tip jar at paypal.me/philosophytube, or if you could make a regular donation at patreon.com/philosophytube, that helps me pay my bills and afford food, as well as buy more books.